Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet. Welcome back, Father.
Well, Colleen, great to be with you again.
It's great to have you here in the studio. It's going to be an exciting topic that we're talking about today, too, one that we've talked about a lot. We're going to be talking about demographic winter and why the government can't fix the demographic winter, which is obviously something that a lot of governments are trying to do right now.
Correct.
So, and this is based on a Spirit in Life that you wrote recently, which I will link in the description as well, so people can return to that. So let's just start. I think a lot of people know what a demographic winter is, but can you just give like a couple sentence explanation of what we're facing right now and then how we got here?
Right. So, I think people are just really unaware that we're moving toward a period where we're going to reach a moment of the population of the whole of the world itself. And so this is coming from the, United Nations, from their own, demographic studies. So by the year 2050, and that number can move in either direction, we're going to reach, pretty much the highest point, maybe close to 10 billion people, close, if not right at 10 billion. And then what we're going to see is a radical downward turn. And the reason for what we call the demographic winter is because of the depopulation programs and propaganda that we've seen over the last 6-7 decades. And so basically, we're not replacing ourselves on a global scale. And that's really what the demographic winter is, that we're not replacing ourselves. And what we mean by that very simply is that a woman of childbearing years, the number of children that she has within those years. Mm-hmm. And so we consider, replacement would be 3 minimum. Mm-hmm. That means replacing the dad, the mom, and one more. Still very low in itself, but that's what replacement would be.
And the one more is basically to make up for anybody who would never end up having a child, who might die young or who for some reason isn't able to have children. So it's like one for the mom, one for the dad, and one for somebody else.
Right, exactly. Okay. And so, but we're not even reaching that. And so as we know in Europe, as a whole, sitting, well below replacement level. Mm-hmm. The United States itself is below. All the Western countries are below replacement level, some far worse than others. And then we're watching the same thing happen in the what they would call the developing world. Africa, Asia, Latin America. They're also struggling. So these are the things that are adding to this great demographic problem.
Yeah, and it's becoming a lot more common for people to talk about it, because I know that back in like the 60s, 70s, the big thing was overpopulation, that the world is overpopulated and there isn't enough food to feed everybody. And now it's becoming, I think, a lot more mainstream isn't quite the right word, but when you have people like Elon Musk and left-leaning news sources talking about the birth rate falling so drastically, it's something that is becoming a more widespread issue that people are actually waking up to.
Correct.
Which is good that they're talking about it, but it also means that we have to now figure out a way to solve this problem because it's so massive that even the left can't ignore it. So a big thing that is going on to try to fix this problem is a lot of governments are trying to come up with incentives to try to get couples to have more kids.
Right.
And so I do want to talk about that with you for a moment. But before we get there, can you first talk about how the government created this issue?
Right. So, so we just got to really pull back now. We're talking at least minimum 7 decades and even beyond that. This very agenda that began to emerge, that this fear of overpopulation, which really in itself was based on a lie. And based on, poor information, fear mongering, creating an environment, a culture, if you will, where people began to fear the future. Fear what could be the possibility. Would there be enough food? How would we, deal with all the various resources that we would need as a people around the world? And so you would also see governments like the United States, which we've talked about many times in the National Security Study Memorandum 200, which I know we've done many podcasts on and we'll do more, because it was the heart of the U.S. policy of how to look at certain parts of the world and how we must depopulate that part of the world in order that the U.S. may have the resources it needs, and also for national security in the sense of their own understanding of that. So what we see really is government having a vested interest in depopulation, in bringing down the world's population because of these fears. And of course, they were based on a lie. They were based on wrong suppositions.
And that wasn't simply by funding abortions, because obviously that, like the Mexico City policy, controls money actually going towards abortions, but by promoting unchaste sex education or contraception and other programs trying to encourage people not to have children, that is one way that they would do this in the developing world, I believe.
In a sense, yes. You're promoting contraception, sterilization, changing people's understanding of sexuality, and also undermining the family, breaking down the family.
Yeah.
And so once you start breaking down these great values, the beauty of marriage, the beauty of family life, the understanding of sexual love between a husband and wife, the fruit of their love, the getting of children, and you start breaking down those understandings, and you start stripping those moors, if you will, the ropes that hold all this together. The government really does, create a culture. It creates a mindset, a framework that becomes this demographic winter that we're talking about. And so government really is the culprit here. It is the one that has created this problem.
Is it the only culprit, or are there multiple culprits?
Well, there are multiple culprits, but
Okay.
obviously we know that it's, government played a very heavy hand in this. And obviously you have ideologues and people that are committed to various ideologies that have been part of this. But the real culprit here really is governments, just like the U.S. through NSM 200.
Yes.
And so when you look at, so I should just say the title instead of the letters.
NSM 200.
But when you look at that, that is a state document, a policy that's still enforced today. So even though you see governments talking about the issue of depopulation and the consequence of that, you still have state policies, government policies that are working, in contradiction, to this great need, that is to raise up these values. So government is not going to be the answer here. It really is the culprit in the kind of the snake in the house that is created this framework, this mindset. And that's why in the article I talk about a hopelessness, and so when you look at how people are afraid of tomorrow, they're afraid of the future. We've created, through a false narrative on climate change, and not having a genuine conversation about being a steward of God's creation, but fear-mongering, gaslighting the situation, raising people, and our children now generations of children have been raised in this framework, in this mindset. They themselves would see their great aunts, great uncles, maybe their great grandparents if they were fortunate. And you say how many siblings they had, 5, 6, 7, and more. And then you start looking at their parents or maybe their grandparents and seeing 1 or 2. And you yourself see it with your own eyes, and you begin to ask questions. Why the change? What's happened?
Well, not only that, but then you have a cultural shift towards shaming women who have more than a couple kids, where it's like,
Right.
Why did you have so many kids? You shouldn't have had so many kids. Like, do you
Right.
know what causes that?
That's
And
right.
having that attitude too, which has became more entrenched in the society.
And then, of course, we can go back to government with that. With communism, obviously, women working outside of the home, breaking down the family mores, all these various things, that have been introduced into various government policies and government action. And so these things have now filtered all the way down to the current moment. And so what we've done is we've flip-flopped the values. So, and as a consequence, now they're looking at this and going, well, how did we get here? Because it's the same leftist agendas, the same politicians, the same bureaucrats that many years ago, preached this overpopulation, this great fear, we're not going to be able to have enough food, we're not going to have enough resources. Now they're the same people now trying to say, wait a minute, we have a problem here. And, and I think what's important, Colleen, is just to stop, and for a moment and say, did anyone ever think, what are the consequences to these agendas? What are the long-term impact? I think, and we've talked about this in China, for example, that really, government there has kind of been bewildered because when you think about the one-child policy that they implemented, and even though there's been some lessening of those restrictions, they created a culture that surprised them. Because they're thinking now with all the incentives, which I know we're going to talk a little bit about other governments, but you look at the incentivizations that they've offered and you're going, and it hasn't worked. And they're going, wait a minute, why is this not working? Because you've created such a culture of anti-family, anti-children, antinatalism is what you've created. And now you've also created a culture, which John Paul talked about, in the Western mindset of appropriation and consumption. You've created a culture that really now wants, is consumerism. And a child or children in people's minds is costly. And so now you've created, even, was it Newsweek? I think it was Newsweek that Dr. Brian Close talks about this, where they had a barcode on the top. It was the front page. I think it was Newsweek. And we can always verify that. And where they put the barcode on the baby's head, and the article basically is just talking about it's costly. It's millions of dollars to raise a child, and so you look at this, and he can even tell you, or we can even put in the little notes what year that came out. It was in the 70s, if I remember correctly. And so you look at this, so this is just propaganda, constant propaganda.
Say a propaganda push to encourage people not to have children.
Right. And even within the school systems, by changing, our understanding of human sexuality.
Yeah.
And really debasing, sexuality into nothing more than which is feeling and pleasure. And so we, through the sex education programs and those various ways, you just unmoor children from Judeo-Christian values and so forth. And here we are. And here we are, where you have young women today in parts of the world on their 18th birthday celebrating a sterilization party, having themselves sterilized. You're having young couples today who are wanting to be married, but choosing not to welcome children. So they themselves either contracepting, or having themselves sterilized, in a permanent manner. So these are, when you realize the hopelessness, the fear, but underneath it is a kind of a subculture working, and that's going to be the real challenge as we go forward, not only the consequences of such agendas where we are now, and we'll talk more about that, but how is it going to be changed? How do you change that? Because now we're talking about a cultural understanding, a framework, a mindset that's been created.
Well, and it's really good that people have been raising awareness to this issue, because obviously it's something that we do need to talk about. We need to be aware that it's going on. But I've noticed that a lot of the people that are raising awareness about the population issue, the birth rate issue, are proposing economic incentives or government incentives to try to turn this problem around and pivot and start getting people at least back to replacement rate.
Right.
And you hold that wouldn't work. So let's first talk about what they're actually proposing, because I don't know enough about what the economic incentives they're thinking of. And then could you explain why that doesn't work? Because if they created this issue through incentives and propaganda and trying to influence people to not have children, why can't they just reverse that and use the same tactics to encourage people to have children?
And part of that is what has been shared. You're so entrenched within the mindset that that welcoming children of any larger number, beyond that one or two, is bad for the planet, bad for the government, bad. So you since you've created this
but if the government started saying it's good for the planet, it's good for the culture, wouldn't that change it?
Well, no, because basically that means that the government must have been lying. So people really look at this and say, you can't have this principle of non-contradiction at work, and so now you're saying this and you said this, but you've created decades of propaganda, policy, programs, incentives, education. It's not going to just happen because you offer some voucher.
Okay, but we are seeing people realizing that the government or other, like big pharma, big agriculture, all of these groups might not have been 100% honest about things in the past 60 to 70 years. Do you think that's going to be helpful to changing the birth rate?
Part of it will be, and you'll see this when we talk, I'm also just kind of leap into it. When you think of some of the ways they have incentivized this. So some governments have actually offered that, tax breaks. Maybe even offering a payout, a certain amount of money, that to maybe encourage you to have a second child or maybe a third child. Maybe the promising of a lower house note, maybe paying 1 year's notes. All these, you got examples of all over the place.
You get a minivan for more kids. Right.
Or I know in one country where that if you welcomed over 4 children, that they will give you a home. A property with so much acreage, and so, again, that hasn't worked. Doesn't mean some people haven't done so, but on the larger scale that they're looking for. And part of it really is you have to undo the mind, and because part of it is that government policy has so imposed itself on the family. So the high cost of things. Even if you try bringing some things down, the reality is it's still costing in so many ways. So I would say that the way the government could, it would have to really restructure so much of the way it approaches, bringing down the cost of goods, bringing down the amount of taxes that are being paid, making things, in the sense of incentivizing, from an economic point, families to not be afraid of tomorrow. If you keep, kind of this, give an example, you're promoting climate change issues and you're kind of gaslighting that issue. And at the same time, you're telling people, well, welcome more children for the future. Well, wait a minute here. You're telling me the future looks dire. We're on a doomsday path. And over here, you want me to welcome children to what? To experience this doomsday information? Life? Wait a minute here. So you have a contradiction. You have a narrative that doesn't make sense to people. But you really got to, to me, it's not government that's going to answer this. It never was. And government worked against the good. And it had the power and the ability to do so, because if we look here in the United States, the great majority of our young people go through public school systems. So by changing the way that we approach biology, the way that we approach education and sexuality, these were the ways of propagandizing our youth to move through the generations and eventually unmoor them from what their grandparents and great-grandparents would have understood. I look at my own, family that welcomed a larger amount of children. And so, but these were values in themselves. The value of family life, the value of sacrificing for your children, welcoming children and seeing a good in your children, a future in your children, and making those kinds of sacrifices. But we have a narrative, Colleen, that doesn't like the word sacrifice either, doesn't like the fact that I might have to surrender other goods in order to reach toward this good.
Yeah, it does seem like you have a world that has created people to be selfish in a sense. And now the government, by wanting to increase the birth rate, is saying now you have to be selfless, but it hasn't done like the legwork to encourage that virtue.
Well, because it's not the role of government necessarily, to teach virtue. I mean, you want virtue to be in our governments and virtuous people in government serving, but we would say that, the government has worked against the very entity, or entities, I would say, within the religions of the world, where our families are nurtured, and guided and supported, and where we learn these core values in that primary unit, the family. And, by attacking the family, assaulting the family, on kind of divorcing the family, from obligation toward each other. You see this with euthanasia, you see it with the abortion, you see it with the issues that we're talking about. So government, in a sense, it should be there to support this good, not work against this good. This is something John Paul talked about often, in the sense that, the role of government. Pope Benedict, Pope Francis has been talking about this, that government has kind of set its will against the primary good, the fundamental unit that builds a civil society, a society of order and discipline and virtue. And so government plays with that and has a role in that and can aid in that. But here, by doing what is done, in the sense of its propaganda, its agenda, its ideology, it's really set the family, as to be a negative. It's portrayed the family as not a good in society, and then this when you go into places and where you see a family with a larger number of children, how many times are they mocked, made fun of by other people? This is something that government has created. This is what an agenda has done. So in people's minds, how do you? The only way to unravel that is turning back toward what I know we're going to talk about. What's the remedy? And we'll talk about it in a second, but maybe we can talk about some of the countries before we go there.
Oh, I don't know the details of which different countries have tried things. So if you know them, I'd be happily learn what they're doing. But I know that there have been incentives in place in countries, I think Japan and maybe in Eastern Europe, but I don't know the specifics.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you just a couple of examples now. Whether or not this is still occurring, Belarus is a good example that again wants to raise its population. So it's one of the countries that is offering incentives incentives that if you welcome, more than, 3 children, you'll help you with a larger apartment. And, if you have 4 children, you might be able to get 2 apartments, kind of a larger living space. Other incentives are there. But you look at places where in the United States, even President Trump is currently talking about, looking at how we tax and how we how we approach the family, and so even you hear these things in our own country, being done. And so Hungary is another example where they've tried, and though they've had a little success by increasing, they're still at 1.5, in their birth rate. And so even after this amount of time, they're not succeeding. And so I really believe that, that it's not like we don't want incentives to happen. I think that's very important, that we want government to be supportive of these true goods. We don't, at the same time, we need to realize that government that created this problem and agendas that the government supported that created this problem, and the ideologies that they backed and advanced and actually implemented, they're not the remedy. But they can help in the transformation by doing the very things that we've been talking about. Is that how do we, support the family? But I mean, let's be honest, we've redefined the family as well.
This is true too.
So we have another issue. So we have to return, to these very core principles that have guided millennia, and that we've just somehow thought we can just unmoor ourselves from, and there would be no consequences to it.
It does seem like the government would have to play a supporting role in trying to reverse the birth rate issue rather than the primary role. I guess I'm just wondering if there's a way that government incentives could encourage people to be married and like heterosexual couple, welcoming children, making that like, I don't know. It was funny because before we started this episode, I was like, I'm just going to ask not Twitter, X's AI, how to fix the birth rate problem. And it came up with things because I was just curious because I was like, these are interesting things to respond to. And it's like, I didn't trust Google, so I figured I would ask X. But it was saying things like child benefits and tax credits, like we've talked about, but then also things like marriage incentives, of encouraging marriage through various incentives to boost birth rates, or promoting family values, where like having like higher multiple children being seen as like a higher status position, so people want to have children because that's like the elite thing to do in a good way. And then like reducing the cost of living and like helping with like parental leave and different working conditions that have like flexible work hours. So those are just some of the things that
that's interesting.
Grok came up with.
And we probably wouldn't disagree with some of the ways of the ideas. Now, how they approach, how they move on. But let's, if we go back, just 60, 70 years, you think about how the school system, really supported families. They worked with parents for the good of their children. So you look at what was happening just a few decades ago that supported these values. So now the way to kind of where the government can help support that would be, how do we now got to restructure our education system? We have to restructure the textbooks, or reorient the textbooks in a way that doesn't, diminish family life or, mock family life, but we have to also go back what you said too, and that marriage is between one man and one woman. All right. And so, but this is where, again, the transformation would be radical from the government's point of view.
For sure. Yeah.
The United States, for example,
I guess that's kind of where I'm like, what I'm wrestling with right now is it's like, on the one hand, I understand what you're saying of like the government can't fix this problem. On the other hand, it seems like if the government really set its mind to it, it could help at least like support and incentivize those first principles of like man and a woman in marriage, getting married and having multiple kids. Right.
But where do those values really originate? And that, if you think about our Judeo-Christian root. And so, as we saw with Pope Benedict and John Paul II, really, condemning the mindset of Europe that rejected Western civilization and the whole understanding of Christianity and how it played a strong role in the development of Europe, and it basically just ignoring its root. And here, in the United States, where right now we fight against, religion and the freedom freedom to exercise that religion. And so we're pushing against the very source that actually fosters within the structure these core values within the families, and where not only fidelity and exclusivity and monogamy and, purity and chastity and all these things are learned, but the government's been pushing against that completely. And so the way the government can help here would be to support the faith communities, to be able to instill these values and to be able to advance those values, and for government to stop working against these values and undermining these values. And the whole idea of divorce is another example that really has caused great harm. How can we reevaluate that and how do we restructure the mindset of what it means to be faithful to one another for a lifetime? And
so basically the government needs to stop trying to like smother the family and tear it down, and then create a structure that like supports the family. I don't know, I guess I'm thinking of like the tomato vine climbing through like the metal structure. It's like the government needs to be the like metal structure so that the vine of the family can actually grow and be supported.
Well, I think that the idea is we give too much emphasis to government. It's not the role of government. And so, and I think this is the problem. This is where the problem started, because we've given over ourselves to government. I mean, parents, maybe we talked about this before, gave over to local government the education of their children. Well, the government's not the educator of their child. The parents are the educator of the child. The government is there to offer incentive and help and assistance. But we've kind of given over our own responsibilities, and as a result, I mean, government doesn't give birth to itself. It's people. People come from families and structures that become part of the governmental policies and legislators and those in leadership. So they don't fall from any little tree. They come from a family structure. They come from a framework. They come from an understanding. Because we have people who work in government and serve in government who are doing admirable work, who are doing everything they can to support these core values. But they're within a larger system that also is very difficult to direct. So we shouldn't be looking to government. The principle of subsidiarity works very beautifully here. And, understanding the primary cell upon which society is built is the family. And that is where the remedy has always been. And why, from a spiritual level, so I know we didn't want to get too down that road, but the idea is that's why Satan assaults the family so aggressively, because he also understands that undermine the family and you undermine all these other values. And so you just strip them, because you remove the ability of the family to shape and to create a culture, what we call the domestic church, right? And so government is not ever going to be the remedy here. And it could also have not been the problem if it had kept its proper place. And so government intruded, and it placed itself in a higher position of responsibility that it did not own and did not have a right to. And so this is where, again, we shouldn't be looking to the government to solve our problem. And what we should be looking to is how do we re-engage the conversation, recreate the narrative that truly has guided many a civilization throughout the centuries. And we can look back at history and know that when we undermine the family, when we turn in, like you said, we become self-centered, selfish. That's the undermining. That's what that pulls the Moors up and basically destroys the civilization.
So what is the solution then? Because I think that people turn to the government because they see a widespread issue that's going to have serious economic, social consequences that is so broad that just like changing your own family and doing things within your family seems like a really small, drop of water in a big ocean.
Right.
So what is the remedy if it's not supposed to be the government trying to step in and turn the problem that it started
Well, if
around?
I could, I'll return to a podcast we did a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. It could be longer now. It goes by so fast. Is when you think about, when, and I'm going to just use this as an example. So you have a family that moves onto a property in a territory. Well, they're one family. All right. And so, but then another family moves in about 4 miles away, and then a third family moves in, and a fourth family moves in. Well, so all of a sudden it begins to move from a little community to a little town, and the little town grows into now a city. And then you might be looking at, well, what are the roads like? what kind of infrastructure? How do we handle plumbing? How do
Mhm.
we handle sewage? How do we handle electrification? What kind of schools are we going to have? How, because now there is a greater need. So government has a valid role to play, a very important role to play. And that is when self-governance. We as a community come together and we might elect someone to oversee how to handle these various things. We might even choose to tax ourselves so that
Mhm.
we have money to be able to get the grass cut, make sure the roads are paved, make sure the power plant works, make sure that the sewer plant is doing its job. So we do that is self-governance.
Mhm.
We do this so that we can better the community we call the common good. Now we have a common good involved.
Yeah.
So government, so I want us to walk away from the podcast, for people to think, oh, we're anti-government by any means, by no means.
Mm-mm.
The role of government has a valid and legitimate place to play, but it should never supplant the primary and fundamental unit that builds our society, and that is the family. And so here is where government should be working for that good, supporting that good, defending that good. And what's happened is we've allowed a plurality of ideologies to creep in here. And what's happened is that we've allowed all these things to become legitimate, almost in a sense,
Mhm.
a right to. But in reality, it's all worked against the fundamental unit. So
Mhm.
when we allow the breakdown of the family, and we can, obviously, there are many reasons why that occurs, but government had a vested interest in the fidelity and exclusivity of marriage. And
Mhm.
history has shown that. There's a reason why that's so important. And from that exclusive and faithful union, then you can build a culture where children are raised in a safe home, a family, where they learn these core values and they're able to grow, as a way of seeing what's my contribution to the common good, what's my contribution, because family's not about me, it's
Mhm.
about us. And so the family plays a very key role in this, whether that person be whatever religious background. There are core values that guide those religions and
Mhm.
guide the people of faith and how to exercise that. And so, in all of them, and we know because we know the history, we know what happened in 1930. All right. And so, and our audience, if they don't know, they can just go type in 1930 and they'll pick up a subject that we've talked about many times. In our country, when was divorce legalized?
Mhm.
When did we legalize the use of contraception? When did we legalize abortion? And what are we doing? We're legalizing euthanasia. So we're actually, in every act of doing this, we're breaking the links
Mhm.
of a husband and wife to each other, a husband and wife to their children, the children and the husband and wife to the grandparents to the children and the parents. It's all links, it's all chains that link
Yeah.
everyone together. And when you start doing these things, you're breaking those links. And if you break the link, then someone else fills the gap. And isn't that exactly what government has done? It's
Mhm.
come in and promoted, in this situation, a propaganda that was false. It was started on a false premise, and it's now been proven how false it is. And look at the damage now that is being done across this planet. And what people like Elon Musk is talking about, and many others, from an economic point of view, looking at, so let's use Greece,
Mhm.
let's use California, let's use many, I can go through Japan, a litany of places. So states, individual states, countries, where they have, because of the lower population, they don't have a tax base to be able to support the infrastructures that they have created, the social programs that they have created. So now we're back down to, how are we going to pay for electricity? How do we maintain our plants? How do we maintain our bridges, our roads?
Mhm.
So all this,
I saw a great article again when I was just kind of doing some research trying to prepare for this episode too, where somebody was going through the economic impact of like, okay, if you have um an area where there's not a lot of population, then nobody's going to want to maintain the lands. You're going to have these places where there used to be houses, there used to be buildings, there used to be stores that no one's living in that are just falling to pieces and no one's maintaining it. And they're like, how is this good for the planet?
Right.
Like, if you really want it to be good for the planet, you want to have a place where people take value in their land because their land has worth, even just from an economic supply and demand perspective.
Right. I mean, coming from from a family that farmed, the idea of of working the land, tilling the land, taking care of the land, and the land will take care of you, and being able to feed your families, care for your family, and care for other families. So these were very beautiful values, and so my whole point in the article really was point out the fear mongering.
Yeah.
Why are we here? How did we get here? Who is to blame? Well, as you said earlier, it's not just one, but there is a major culprit here that has really, really worked this agenda and still working it.
Yeah.
Still working it and refuses to let it go. And so as a result, we're seeing it in the United States. We're now at this point where if the consequences are in front of us.
I think I'm an impatient person. I'm still stuck on the thing that this is a widespread problem across the globe that needs to be turned around very quickly, or else there's going to be at least some disaster. And if the government isn't the one to try to get these ideas out to everyone or to try to reverse it, do you see a place for the church being able to take a much more robust approach to encouraging people and talking about family life and children? Yeah?
Yes. I think it's a both and, because the church has always played a key role in advancing these goods. Always, in every age. And so she still plays a very important role in this. And that's why, it's, the church has been right all along. What she does, she promotes the good of marriage. She promotes the sanctity of marriage, the exclusivity of marriage, all right? Where are children most truly raised in a positive environment within the family? Who are the primary educators? And we can go through a litany. So who's the one that's been fighting against these false understandings of human sexuality? The church. Who is the one that stands up for the vulnerable, the weak, and the poor against the ideologies of euthanasia and abortion? The church. Who is the one that stands up that marriage is only between one man, one woman? The church. In every age. And she has warned in every age, when you abandon these goods and you work against them and you set your will against them, there are dire consequences. So the church has always and will always be the one that plays a central role in this. And so yes, she is definitely part of the remedy. But the idea is it's not going to solve overnight. As the governments have learned around the world that by offering, and this is not something new, this has been going on for over a decade now, some of these incentives. And it has not worked. It has not proven any of value. So, and why? As we've been sharing about, and there's so many other reasons, Colleen, but we don't have time in a podcast to go through, but it's a both and. So if the government itself sees its proper role, sees its proper contribution, and promotes those goods for being goods in themselves. Marriage is a good in itself that we should promote. We should promote fidelity and exclusivity. We should promote purity and chastity within society. It's a good for every person to live the nature of who the human person is. We need to protect human life and defend human life. Government should not be working to give so-called rights to destroy life. So there's so many things that we need to really look at that government can be of assistance to. But we've seen this, right, Colleen? Just because we change a law doesn't mean all of a sudden everything is better. We're seeing this now with the overturning of Roe, that we have a tremendous fight in front of us. We've been in the fight, but now the battle is different because we have to get to hearts and minds and change the way people approach. This is not going to solve tomorrow because government A decides to give every family, a 25% tax break. Praise God for the big tax break. But the idea is that is not going to solve it in and of itself.
Yeah. That
it really has to be a collaboration of government seeing its proper role, the church and the faith community, and the people of God around the world seeing their proper role. And as I've said many times, for parents to take responsibility for their children, for government to stop intruding upon those values. I mean, right now in our own country, pivotal in this election cycle is people fighting back against the government, saying, stop intruding upon our families. Who are you to tell us how to raise our children? And hiding things from parents. So again, government is a key culprit in the problem. And it's not just one little issue. It's a larger issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm hopeful that prophetic voices, are being heard, both within the faith community, within the secular community, and maybe there's a way to come to the same table, and maybe from different points of view, but still be able to address the issue.
Do you think there's a way to eventually heal this issue without some type of like religious revival? In like bringing people back to faith, helping them understand like their context within the great history of God?
I think, being in different communities around the world and living where I live here in the Front Royal community here in Virginia, where you see a welcoming of larger family life, faith life, where people are contributing to the local community, part of the community, being integral in changing and helping and assisting their neighbors. So yes, it can be turned. It will. It will not be at the speed that people would like to see.
That wasn't exactly what I was saying. I was saying like, so the places that you just mentioned are places where there is this like great spiritual richness.
Right.
Do you think it's possible to be able to turn this around without that spiritual richness? Like we have a culture that is like very atheist, very agnostic. The amount of people that are like faithful Catholics is very small. Does Catholicism need to spread, or like the Christianity and Christian values need to spread to be able to reverse this demographic winter?
Judeo-Christian values have always been key in the transformation of culture and the renewal of culture and the reorientation of culture, society. So absolutely. Okay. And so, and here in our community where we see, family life occurring, these are your next generation. And so that are going to go out forward, and they're going to now be the seed.
And what prompted that question was a tweet that I had seen that Elon had made where he was like, you can have the morals without the religion. And when talking about this issue specifically, and that was kind of more of that's why I was asking this question, was like, can you have the morals without the religion? And it doesn't sound
again,
like...
I do not believe that's the role of government. And so in a sense, from a secular point, it really, because again, that's not the source of it. And
he wasn't talking about government, just reversing the birth rate in general.
Right.
He was like, you can have the pro-fertility morals without the religion.
Yeah, but again, it won't work, and as it's proven, it's not working because you're unmooring it, you're divorcing it from its source, from its fundamental understanding, and so no matter what economic incentive or government policy, you're not going to have the outcome.
Just value system you're adopting.
Right.
Like
exactly.
I think what he's adopting, not even from a government perspective of like, I see the problems with this down the road, so I need to have children and then get other people who are also not religious to see this is the problem down the road.
But in that situation, and what we haven't mentioned is that children are not a commodity. So here, it's important that, so when you take that approach, then we're looking at a child as a thing, as a kind of a, if I get a new car, I can go a little faster and I save more gasoline. A child is not a thing and a commodity. And so we need to be careful as we start even talking about, how to bring about the transformation, that again, we're not treating the child as something to be used, but a child to be welcomed and family life to be celebrated and the sacredness of that. And this is where those moral values and those moral principles take deeper root, and they're not hinged upon an ideology or a government program. They really are fundamental. And so that's where I would disagree with Ellen. Yes, I mean, we have lots of philanthropists, he being one, that is very generous, but there are many out there that are not necessarily moral.
You don't want to swing from like a demographic winter to like some type of dystopian, let's create children in like fake wombs and bring them into the world, or like force women to have children to like fix the demographic winter, I think is basically what, like you don't want to go from one extreme to the other extreme.
Right.
Without actually having any transformation of heart.
And you could see that very easily occurring in the sense, especially with the technology today and the artificial reproductive technologies, the in vitro fertilization, a litany of issues. And this is the danger when government, steps into places where it should not be.
Yes.
And so it's at the same time recognizing its role, understanding its obligation, its duty toward these goods, and also to protect society from the harm. And I think what's interesting, and all that I read about this issue, you don't see anyone admitting they've done something wrong. Even those right now, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the people who were the blowing the horns, 60 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, are the same ones blowing a horn today, but they will never admit we did something wrong. We should not have intruded in this. We should not have gotten into this, and it was based on a lie, and so, but no, you don't hear that.
Well, and you don't even see them recognizing the fact that the two don't work. So I think it was France where it's like on the one hand, they're like, we have a birth rate issue. And then the other hand, that they were like, let's put abortion as part of our constitution,
Right.
I believe, or passed a more permissive
Right.
law, something like that.
Right.
I remember those both happened within a week, and people were pointing out the juxtaposition of how do you say on the one hand, we need to fix the birth rate issue, but we should have more abortion.
Right.
Those two
Right.
are contrary.
That's right. And then and also the idea that, when you look at how we're treating the weak and the vulnerable at the end of life and those with terminal
Mhm.
illnesses, this is not really a society that's moral.
Mhm.
We have really determined arbitrarily, as we've seen in many times in our history, sadly, where
Mhm.
we have delegated or relegated a certain segment of our population not to have rights or values. This is the danger, right? And so so these are the things where, and my suggestion always has been, and still remains, is we return back, now back to the spiritual side here, and that is to what God himself created.
Yeah.
And the very, very the very fundamental unit upon which everything is built.
Mhm.
And that's where we have to turn our attention back. And John Paul even said this, and maybe it's a way to, is that it's, again, the role of government is not to tell this couple, how many children they are to welcome or not welcome,
Mhm.
but they are to assist the couple who, in their own decision and through their own cooperation with God, to help them to be able to live out their family life and to be able to support. And that's what government has a beautiful role to do, and to provide means, to provide what the family by itself may not be able to have access to. But on the larger scale, where government can have a fundamental role that can provide resources and supplement those things that are needed in the family.
Mhm.
All right. And not work against and use the family, and or circumvent the family. And that's the thing that we need to really educate people again. But I would say, Colleen, in closing, is that we have a real fight on our hand.
Yeah.
Because the narrative has been successful. As I mentioned in an article since we brought up IVF, in vitro fertilization, when you look at the narrative of over 80% just within the Catholic community actually believe that they don't see a problem with it. And that's lack of education, lack of understanding.
Mhm.
So I'm not surprised when those in political office, kind of advocate, because they see basically no one really has an issue with it.
Mhm.
So the narrative has been successful.
Mhm.
So now we have to take the narrative back.
Which is why education is so important.
And the same thing here.
Mhm.
We need to re-educate, but let's be honest, part of the education is modeling.
Yeah.
We have a poor modeling of family life, the
Mhm.
breakdown of the family, fatherless, motherless homes, the great litany. So it's really going to have to take that's why I say it's a both and, heavier on the religious community and to be able to help foster these great goods, and the help in government's role is to support those goods. So, but the answer is not in the government.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Father. It's been very interesting, and I think it's an important thing to talk about. If we can't just sit back and be like, let the government fix it. They created the problem, let them fix it. That we actually have to recognize that it's not necessarily their place to do the legwork to fix it.
Right.
And that's actually on us to change hearts and minds. So
Right.
Thank you, Father.
Amen.
And to all of our listeners, please follow, and subscribe. I'm going to link our contraception ebook on the end screen here so you can find out how contraception created the abortion culture, because that was a huge part of this conversation of the government's role originally. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.